In 1942, a father and 4 co-workers vanished during a routine railroad maintenance shift in the Oregon mountains, leaving behind only scattered tools and 70 years of heartbreak for the families who never stopped searching. When a highway construction crew's ground-penetrating radar finally revealed their fate in 2013, the discovery would expose a corporate cover-up so callous that it had allowed 5 families to suffer in ignorance, while executives knew exactly where their loved ones had died. The radio crackled to life at exactly 6:47 in the morning on December 7, 1941. Thomas McKenzie reached over and turned up the volume, his weathered hands still steady despite 53 years of hard living. The news from Pearl Harbor hit the maintenance shed like a physical blow. "This is no drill," the announcer's voice echoed through the small wooden building. "Japanese forces have attacked Pearl Harbor Naval Base. Repeat, this is no drill." Tommy set down his coffee cup and stared at his crew. 4 men who had worked these Oregon mountain rails with him for years, now facing a world that had changed forever in the span of a few hours. Patrick O'Malley, the red-haired Irishman who could fix any piece of equipment with his bare hands, sat frozen on the wooden bench. His younger brother Sean paced nervously by the window, already talking about enlisting. Jacob Kowalski, everyone called him Jake, pulled out a worn photograph of his pregnant wife Mary. She was due any day now with their first child. "What does this mean for us?" he asked quietly. Ray Washington, the only colored man on their crew and the best signal operator in 3 counties, shook his head slowly. "Means everything's about to change, brother. Everything." Tommy stood up and walked to the door, looking out at the snow-covered tracks that stretched into the Cascade Mountains. 28 years he'd been working this stretch of railroad, ever since he came back from the Great War. He'd seen boom times and the Depression, watched young men leave for city jobs and old men die at their posts. But this felt different. "Railroad's going to be more important than ever now," he told his men. "They'll be moving troops, supplies, everything the war effort needs. We keep these tracks running. We're doing our part for our country." The work assignment that morning seemed routine enough. A section of track about 3 miles out toward Devil's Creek had been showing signs of subsidence. Small stuff, probably just winter freeze and thaw cycles affecting the roadbed. But with war declared, they couldn't take any chances. Every mile of track had to be perfect. Tommy gathered his tools and checked the maintenance handcar one last time. The little motorized cart would carry them and their equipment out to the problem section. Patrick loaded the heavy rail sections while Sean organized the smaller tools. Jake double-checked the radio equipment they'd need to stay in contact with the dispatcher. Ray reviewed the signal protocols for the morning freight trains. At 8:30, they climbed aboard the handcar and headed into the mountains. The morning was clear and cold, with fresh snow making everything look clean and peaceful. None of them spoke much about the war news. There would be plenty of time for talking later. Tommy waved to Harold Brennan, their supervisor, as they left the yard. "Be back by 5, he called out. It was the last time anyone would see the 5 railroad workers alive. What happened to them in those mountains would remain a mystery for 71 years. Harold Brennan had been a railroad supervisor for 15 years, and he'd never missed a 6 o'clock morning check. December 8, 1941, started like any other day, with frost covering the windows of the maintenance shed and his breath forming clouds in the cold Oregon air. But when he pushed open the heavy wooden door, something felt wrong immediately. The shed was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty in a way that made his stomach clench with worry. Tommy's coffee cup sat on the workbench, still half full, with a thin skin of cream floating on top. The coffee was stone cold. Patrick O'Malley's tool belt hung on its usual peg, but his favorite hammer was missing from the loop. Sean's work gloves lay crumpled on the floor near the door, as if he'd dropped them in a hurry. Harold called out their names, his voice echoing in the small space. "Tommy, Patrick, you boys in here?" Nothing answered him back except the wind rattling the loose boards on the roof. He checked the schedule board twice. They were supposed to be working the Devil's Creek section, routine track maintenance that should have had them back by 5 the previous evening. The handcar was gone, which made sense. They would have taken it out to the work site. But why hadn't they come back? Harold pulled on his heavy coat and fired up his own motorized cart, heading out along the tracks toward Devil's Creek. The morning sun was just starting to burn through the mountain fog, casting long shadows between the pine trees. 3 miles out, he found their handcar sitting perfectly centered on the rails, as if someone had carefully positioned it there. The little motorized vehicle looked normal from a distance, but as Harold got closer, his worry deepened into something approaching panic. Tools were scattered across the cart's platform. Some had fallen onto the gravel roadbed. A thermos of coffee lay on its side, the contents frozen into brown ice crystals. Harold climbed down from his cart and walked around the abandoned handcar, looking for any sign of what might have happened. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no torn clothing caught on the equipment. It was as if 5 grown men had simply decided to walk away from their work in the middle of a job. The rail section they'd been sent to repair showed clear signs that work had begun. New spikes lay ready to be driven, and someone had loosened the bolts on the problem joint. But the job was maybe 10% finished. Why would they stop in the middle of such important work, especially with the war news making everyone more conscious of their duties? Harold spent 2 hours searching the immediate area, calling their names until his voice grew hoarse. He checked every possible hiding spot, every maintenance shack, every section of track within walking distance. When the 9 o'clock freight train approached, he had to move both handcars off the main line, his hands shaking as he worked the manual controls. By 10 o'clock that morning, Harold Brennan was back at the dispatch office, placing the call that would launch the biggest missing persons investigation in Oregon Railroad history. The call came into the Jackson County Sheriff's Office at 10:23 that Monday morning. Sheriff William Hayes had been dealing with Pearl Harbor hysteria all weekend, fielding reports of suspicious lights, strange accents, and imagined saboteurs behind every tree. But Harold Brennan's voice carried a different kind of urgency, the steady panic of a man who knew something was genuinely wrong. 5 of my best workers are missing, Harold said, his words coming fast over the crackling phone line. Left their handcar on the tracks, tools scattered everywhere. This isn't like them, Sheriff. These are reliable men, been working these rails for years. Hayes grabbed his coat and badge. In peacetime, missing adults might wait 24 hours before serious action. But December 8, 1941, wasn't peacetime anymore. The railroad was now critical infrastructure, a lifeline for moving troops and supplies to the West Coast. 5 missing railroad workers could mean sabotage, and sabotage could mean the war had come to Oregon. Within 2 hours, search parties were forming at the Cascade Junction depot. Sheriff's deputies arrived first, followed by railroad security men in their distinctive blue uniforms. Local volunteers showed up without being asked, farmers and loggers who knew these mountains better than any official searcher. The word spread through town like wildfire. 5 good men vanished without a trace. Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie arrived at the depot just after noon, still wearing her nurse's uniform from the night shift at the county hospital. At 26, she was Tommy's eldest daughter, a strong woman who'd inherited her father's stubborn determination. She pushed through the crowd of searchers, demanding answers nobody had. My father wouldn't just disappear, she told Sheriff Hayes, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He's worked this railroad since 1913. He knows every mile of track, every bridge, every dangerous crossing. If he's missing, something happened to him. The first search teams headed out along the tracks within the hour. Railroad Security Chief Marcus Webb led one group toward Devil's Creek, following the route the missing men should have taken. Sheriff Hayes took another team north toward the Timber Company roads, checking for any sign the men might have wandered off course. The abandoned handcar became the center of the investigation. Webb examined every tool, every piece of equipment, looking for clues about what might have happened. The worksite showed clear evidence that rail repair had begun but been interrupted suddenly. Fresh coffee in the thermos suggested they'd been working that morning, not the previous day. Could be bears, suggested Deputy Jim Morrison, a local man who'd grown up hunting these woods. Big Grizzly could scatter a work crew pretty fast. But there were no bear tracks in the soft earth around the handcar. No signs of the kind of chaos a bear attack would leave behind. By evening, over 50 searchers were combing the mountain forests. They called out the missing men's names until their voices echoed off the canyon walls. Flashlight beams danced between the pine trees as darkness fell, but the mountains kept their secrets. 5 railroad workers had simply vanished into the Oregon wilderness, leaving behind only questions and the growing fear that the war might have found its way to their quiet mountain town. FBI Special Agent Robert Sterling arrived in Cascade Junction on the morning train from Portland, his black government sedan following on the next freight car. It was December 10th, 1941, just 3 days after Pearl Harbor, and the entire West Coast was gripped by invasion fever. Sterling had investigated sabotage cases in Washington and California, but 5 missing railroad workers in the Oregon mountains presented a new kind of threat. Sterling set up his temporary office in the back room of the railroad depot, spreading files and photographs across Harold Brennan's desk. The agent was a thin, serious man in his 30s who spoke in clipped sentences and took notes in a small leather book. Everything about him suggested federal authority and wartime urgency. These men had access to critical infrastructure, Sterling explained to Sheriff Hayes during their first meeting. They could disable tracks, damage bridges, disrupt troop movements along the entire West Coast corridor. We have to consider the possibility they were enemy agents. The background investigations began immediately. Sterling's team of federal agents descended on the families, asking questions that felt more like interrogations. They wanted to know about political beliefs, foreign contacts, any suspicious behavior in the weeks before the disappearance. Patrick O'Malley's background raised immediate red flags. His grandfather had immigrated from County Cork in 1892, and Patrick still received letters from relatives in Ireland. More concerning, his cousin had married a German immigrant family in Portland. Sterling circled those connections in red ink, building a web of suspicion around the missing redhead who could fix any piece of railroad equipment. "The O'Malley boy speaks some German," reported Agent Collins after interviewing neighbors. "Learned it from his cousin's in-laws. Could be innocent, but it's worth noting." Sterling added another red mark to Patrick's file. Jacob Kowalski's Polish heritage also drew scrutiny, despite his family's 3 generations in America. His pregnant wife Mary broke down during questioning, sobbing that Jake loved this country more than anything except their unborn baby. He wanted to enlist after Pearl Harbor, she told the agents. Said his railroad work was keeping him from fighting for America. Ray Washington faced different suspicions. As the only colored worker in the group, some locals whispered he might harbor resentment against a country that didn't treat him as an equal. But his military service record from the Great War contradicted those theories. He'd volunteered for combat duty in France, earned a Purple Heart at Belleau Wood, and come home to work quietly on the railroad for 22 years. The most surprising background check concerned Tommy McKenzie himself. Sterling's investigation revealed that the respected foreman had been asking unusual questions about train schedules in the weeks before his disappearance. He'd inquired about military freight loads, troop transport timing, and cargo manifests, information that went beyond his normal maintenance duties. Could be innocent curiosity, Sterling wrote in his report, or evidence of intelligence gathering for enemy purposes. Each new piece of information seemed to support the sabotage theory, but the families insisted their missing men were loyal Americans who would never betray their country. The FBI investigation was building a case for wartime treason, but the truth was far more complicated than Agent Sterling could imagine. By Christmas of 1941, the investigation had generated more theories than evidence. Sheriff Hayes kept a growing list of possibilities tacked to his office wall, each one seeming reasonable until the facts proved otherwise. The 5 missing railroad workers had become a puzzle with too many pieces and no clear picture. The bear attack theory gained support when local hunter Jim Patterson reported finding claw marks on trees near Devil's Creek. "Big grizzly been through here recently," he told the search teams, pointing to deep gouges in the bark about 8 feet off the ground. But Dr. Martin Webb, a wildlife expert from the State University, examined the marks and shook his head. "These are old, probably from last spring. Besides, bears would leave blood, torn clothing, some kind of physical evidence." Industrial accident with a cover-up became the next leading theory. Railroad companies had been known to hide workplace deaths to avoid safety investigations and compensation claims. Agent Sterling pressed Harold Brennan hard on this possibility during multiple interviews. Maybe they fell into machinery, got caught in equipment, and the company decided to make the bodies disappear, Sterling suggested. But Brennan's records showed no unusual equipment activity, no missing tools that could have caused fatal accidents. The robbery theory emerged when Deputy Morrison discovered that Tommy McKenzie had been carrying the crew's weekly payroll, nearly $200 in cash. "Could be drifters, desperate men looking for easy money," Morrison proposed. "Kill the workers, take the cash, dump the bodies somewhere remote." Search teams scoured every ravine and creek bed within 10 miles, but found no trace of violence or hidden graves. Desertion to avoid military service seemed plausible to some investigators. With war declared, all able-bodied men faced potential draft notices. Maybe the 5 workers had decided to disappear into the wilderness, rather than risk being sent overseas. But their families rejected this theory completely. Jake was trying to enlist, Mary Kowalski insisted through her tears. He wanted to fight for his country, not run from it. The search dogs provided the most frustrating clue of all. Bloodhounds from the state prison tracked the missing men's scent easily from the maintenance shed to their abandoned handcar. From there, the trail led along the railroad tracks for another half-mile before suddenly stopping at Devil's Creek Bridge. The dogs circled the area, whined, and refused to pick up the scent again on either side of the creek. "It's like they just vanished into thin air," said handler Pete Rogers, a man who'd been working with tracking dogs for 20 years. "I've never seen anything like it. The dogs are completely confused." Some searchers suggested the men might have waded upstream to throw off pursuit, but the December creek was running high and ice-cold, making such a plan nearly suicidal. Weather became the investigation's worst enemy. A heavy snowstorm hit the mountains on December 20th, covering any remaining evidence under 3 feet of fresh powder. Search teams could no longer examine the ground for footprints, disturbed vegetation, or dropped personal items. By New Year's Day of 1942, the official search was quietly suspended. 5 men had vanished completely, leaving behind only questions and grieving families. Margaret McKenzie stood at her kitchen window every morning at 6 o'clock, watching the railroad tracks that curved past their small house on Elm Street. It had been her routine for 28 years of marriage, making Tommy's coffee and watching him walk to work. Now, 3 months after his disappearance, she still found herself setting out 2 cups before remembering he wouldn't be coming home. The hardest part was explaining to the children. At 14, their son Robert tried to be the man of the house, taking odd jobs after school to help with expenses. 12-year-old Susan cried herself to sleep most nights, asking when Daddy was coming home. Little Margaret, only 8, kept drawing pictures of her father and leaving them on his empty chair at the dinner table. Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie visited her mother every day after her shifts at the hospital, bringing groceries and checking on the younger children. The family's savings were running low, and the railroad company's promises of support seemed to evaporate as the investigation dragged on without answers. "They keep saying he might have run off," Margaret told her daughter during one of their evening conversations. 28 years he worked those rails. Never missed a day except when the babies were born. Why would he leave us now? Elizabeth had no answer, only the growing certainty that something terrible had happened to her father. The O'Malley family faced different struggles. Patrick and Sean's parents, Bridget and Michael, had emigrated from Ireland 40 years earlier and never fully learned to read English. The FBI's constant questions about German connections and suspicious activities left them confused and frightened. Neighbors who had been friends for decades now crossed the street to avoid them, whispering about possible sabotage and enemy sympathizers. "My boys are good American workers," Bridget insisted to anyone who would listen, her Irish accent thick with emotion. Patrick fixed the church bell last summer for free. Sean helped old Mrs. Peterson with her roof. They would never hurt this country. But the whispers continued, and the O'Malley family found themselves isolated in their grief. Mary Kowalski gave birth to her daughter on January 15, 1942, exactly 1 month after Jake's disappearance. She named the baby Helen, after Jake's mother, and cried for hours, holding the child her husband would never meet. The other wives from the neighborhood brought food and help, but Mary felt completely alone in the world. "He was so excited about being a father," she told the church ladies who came to visit. "Kept talking about teaching the baby to fish, to work with tools, to be strong and independent. Now she'll never even know his voice." The railroad company's modest financial assistance barely covered rent and groceries, forcing Mary to take in washing and mending to make ends meet. Ray Washington's mother, Carla, refused to believe her son was dead. At 73, she had survived slavery, Reconstruction, and decades of discrimination, developing an unshakable faith that her family would endure whatever hardships came their way. "My Raymond is a survivor," she told the preacher at Mount Olive Baptist Church. "He came home from that terrible war in France, and he'll come home from whatever trouble he's in now." The families clung to hope, but hope grew harder to maintain as winter turned to spring with no word from their missing men. In the spring of 1942, the railroad company's executives gathered in a Portland conference room to discuss what they privately called the McKenzie situation. Company President Charles Whitmore sat at the head of the polished oak table, reviewing files that would never see the light of day. The war was escalating, government contracts were pouring in, and 5 missing workers had become an expensive inconvenience. "The families are asking too many questions," reported company lawyer Jonathan Pierce. "Mrs. McKenzie's daughter is a nurse, educated, persistent. She's been requesting copies of work orders, safety reports, incident logs. We can't keep stalling forever." The other executives nodded grimly, understanding the implications. An educated woman asking the right questions could uncover things the company preferred to keep buried. Whitmore opened a manila folder marked confidential and spread photographs across the table. The images showed the Devil's Creek work site from multiple angles, but these weren't the same pictures shared with investigators. "Our survey team found something on December 15th, he said quietly, 3 days before we officially suspended the search. The photographs revealed what appeared to be a collapsed cave entrance about 200 yards from where the handcar was discovered. Fresh rockfall covered the opening, and metal detectors had picked up signals suggesting tools and equipment buried beneath the debris. A company geologist had confirmed that the area sat above an extensive natural cave system, the kind that could easily trap unwary explorers. "They went into that cave system," Whitmore continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The earthquake on December 7th, same day as Pearl Harbor, must have triggered a collapse. They're buried down there, probably dead since the first day. The room fell silent as the executives absorbed this information. Pierce cleared his throat nervously. Why didn't we report this to the authorities? The families deserve to know what happened to their men. Whitmore's expression hardened, revealing the cold calculation that had built the company's wartime fortune. Recovery would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. Dangerous excavation, specialized equipment, months of work. And for what? To recover 5 bodies and face massive lawsuits for unsafe working conditions? Whitmore closed the folder with finality. The war effort needs our resources focused on moving troops and supplies, not expensive body recovery operations. The cover-up began immediately. Work orders from December 7th were altered to remove any mention of cave exploration or geological surveys. The company's copy of the site photographs disappeared from official files. Harold Brennan, the supervisor who knew too much about the actual work assignments, received a promotion that transferred him to a rail yard 300 miles away. Company settlements were offered to the families in March of 1942. Margaret McKenzie received $5,000, enough to keep the family housed and fed for several years. Mary Kowalski got $3,000 for herself and baby Helen. The O'Malley parents and Ray Washington's mother received similar amounts, all contingent on signing agreements that prevented further legal action against the railroad. It's guilt money, Elizabeth McKenzie told her mother when the settlement papers arrived. They know something they're not telling us. But Margaret was exhausted by months of uncertainty and financial stress. She signed the papers, taking money that felt like blood payment for her husband's life. The railroad executives took their secret to their graves, leaving 5 families to wonder forever what really happened in those Oregon mountains. The first false hope came in 1953 when a Boy Scout troop found a rusted lunch pail wedged between rocks near Crater Lake, 60 miles south of the original search area. The pail bore the faded initials J.K. scratched into the metal, and Mary Kowalski drove 3 hours with baby Helen to examine it. Her hands shook as she turned the corroded container over, remembering the identical pail Jake had carried to work every day for 7 years. "It's his," she whispered to the state trooper who had called her. "He carved those initials the week we got married. Said he wanted everyone to know whose lunch they were looking at." The discovery made headlines across Oregon and reignited the investigation briefly. Search teams combed the Crater Lake area for weeks, but found nothing else. The lunch pail had probably washed downstream during spring floods, traveling dozens of miles from wherever Jake had actually disappeared. Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie refused to let the case die quietly. Now in her late 30s and head nurse at Portland General Hospital, she had connections throughout the medical and law enforcement communities. She organized what she called memory searches, asking retired railroad workers, old-timers, and long-time residents to share anything they might remember about December of 1941. The breakthrough almost came in 1958 when former railroad supervisor Henry Walsh, dying of cancer in a Vancouver hospital, asked to speak with Elizabeth privately. Walsh had worked the mountain routes for 30 years before retiring, and his conscience had been bothering him for decades. "There were caves up there," he told Elizabeth in a voice barely above a whisper. "Natural limestone formations, some big enough to walk through. The company knew about them, worried about track stability. Your father's crew was supposed to survey one of those caves the day they disappeared." Walsh died 3 days later, before he could provide more specific details about the cave locations. Elizabeth spent months researching geological surveys and railroad company records, but found the cave references Walsh mentioned had been mysteriously removed from official files. Every document she requested seemed to be missing crucial pages, and company officials claimed no knowledge of any cave surveys in the Devil's Creek area. The 1960s brought occasional hikers reporting discoveries that raised hopes and broke hearts. A corroded work glove found hanging from a tree branch. A book of railroad company matches, so weathered the striking surface had dissolved. A piece of blue fabric that might have come from a work shirt, caught on barbed wire near an abandoned logging road. Each discovery triggered new searches and renewed media attention. The families would gather at the sheriff's office, examining the latest find with desperate hope, only to be disappointed when follow-up searches revealed nothing more. The mountains seemed to give up just enough evidence to keep the mystery alive while hiding the complete truth. By 1970, the case files filled 3 large cabinets in the sheriff's basement, hundreds of witness statements, dozens of false sightings, countless theories from professional investigators and amateur detectives. Sheriff Hayes, now nearing retirement, sometimes spent quiet evenings reviewing the files, wondering what he had missed in those crucial early days of the investigation. The 5 missing railroad workers had become part of Oregon folklore, a mystery that defined an entire generation's understanding of how completely people could vanish from the world. In 1976, 35 years after the disappearance, Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie stood before a gathering of 23 people in the basement of Cascade Junction's community center. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she looked at faces that shared her determination, the children and grandchildren of the 5 missing railroad workers who had never stopped searching for answers. "We have better tools now than our parents did," Elizabeth told the group, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades refusing to give up. At 61, she had retired from nursing but channeled all her energy into solving the mystery that had defined her adult life. Metal detectors, topographic maps, citizen band radios. Technology is finally catching up to our need for truth. Robert McKenzie, now 50 and a successful contractor in Portland, had inherited his father's practical skills and his sister's stubborn persistence. "I've been studying the original search patterns," he said, spreading hand-drawn maps across the folding tables. They concentrated on areas within walking distance of the handcar. But what if the men traveled further than anyone assumed? Helen Kowalski had grown up hearing stories about the father she never knew. At 34, she worked as a forest ranger and understood mountain terrain better than any of the original investigators. "There are sections of the Cascade wilderness that have never been properly searched," she explained. "Remote valleys, hidden creek beds, areas the 1940s search teams couldn't reach safely." The annual searches became family traditions that drew participants from across the Pacific Northwest. Every Memorial Day weekend, descendants of the missing workers gathered at the Devil's Creek trailhead with modern camping equipment, detailed maps, and a systematic approach to covering unexplored territory. Susan McKenzie, now 47 and married with children of her own, coordinated the logistics with military precision. She maintained contact lists, organized food supplies, and made sure every search team carried emergency equipment. "My father taught me to be prepared for anything," she would tell newcomers. "He may be gone, but his lessons live on in how we conduct these searches." The searches attracted attention from amateur detective groups and true crime enthusiasts. Some came with genuine desire to help, others seemed more interested in the mystery than the missing men. Elizabeth learned to screen volunteers carefully, focusing on people who understood they were searching for someone's father, husband, son. Metal detectors proved both promising and frustrating. The devices would beep excitedly over buried railroad spikes, forgotten horseshoes, and discarded mining equipment from the area's 19th-century logging operations. Each signal raised hopes that were usually dashed within minutes of digging. The closest they came to a breakthrough was in 1982, when Helen discovered what appeared to be old camping equipment in a ravine 12 miles from the original search area. Rusted cooking pots, fragments of canvas that might have been shelter material, even a corroded pocket knife with initials too weathered to read clearly. "It's from the right time period," confirmed Dr. James Patterson, an archaeologist from the State University who volunteered his expertise. "But there's no way to definitively connect these items to your missing men. Dozens of people camped in these mountains during the 40s and 50s. The next generation refused to accept defeat, but the mountains continued guarding their secrets with frustrating determination. The internet changed everything for the McKenzie case. In 1995, a computer programmer named David Chen created something called the Vanished Workers website, one of the first online forums dedicated to unsolved disappearances. Within months, amateur detectives from around the world were analyzing 70-year-old evidence and proposing theories that ranged from brilliant to bizarre. Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie, now 80 years old and moving slowly but still sharp as a railroad spike, learned to use email with help from her grandson. The digital age brought her into contact with researchers she never could have reached before. Retired FBI agents, geological experts, even former railroad executives willing to share stories their companies had tried to bury for decades. "The power of connected minds is amazing," Elizabeth told a reporter from the Portland Oregonian in 1998. "I've learned more about my father's case in the past 3 years than in the previous 50. The website had attracted serious researchers who brought professional skills to the investigation. Martha Collins, a retired librarian from Eugene, became obsessed with creating the most complete timeline of the disappearance ever assembled. She spent 2 years traveling to archives, interviewing elderly residents, and digitizing newspaper clippings from 1941 and 42. Her research uncovered details that had been forgotten or overlooked for decades. There was a minor earthquake on December 7, 1941, Collins announced during a 1999 conference of amateur investigators. Same day as Pearl Harbor, which is why it didn't make the newspapers. But the Geological Survey recorded a 3.2 tremor centered in the Cascade Mountains, right in the area where the workers disappeared. This information sparked new theories about what might have happened. Maybe the men had taken shelter in a cave or mine shaft that collapsed during the earthquake. Maybe they had been working near an unstable rock formation that gave way. The earthquake angles seemed to explain why the search dogs lost the scent so suddenly, why no bodies were ever found in the original search area. The Discovery Channel contacted Elizabeth in 2001 about featuring the case in their Unsolved Mysteries series. The prospect of national television coverage excited the families, but the network ultimately decided the story lacked the visual elements needed for compelling television. 70 years of nothing but questions doesn't make for good TV, the producer explained apologetically. Internet conspiracy theorists latched onto the case with predictable enthusiasm. Some claimed the railroad workers had discovered a government cover-up and been eliminated to protect state secrets. Others suggested alien abduction, time travel, or involvement in secret military experiments. Elizabeth learned to ignore the wilder theories while staying open to legitimate research. The most promising development came from Dr. James Morrison, a cave exploration expert from Oregon State University. Morrison had been following the case online and offered to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys of the areas where previous searches had failed to find evidence. Modern technology can detect underground voids that wouldn't have been discovered in the 1940s, Morrison explained. If those men fell into a cave system or were trapped by a collapse, we might finally be able to locate them. The digital age had given the families new tools and new hope, but the mountains still held their secrets. Dr. Marcus Chen adjusted his hard hat and surveyed the proposed route for Interstate 84's new mountain bypass. It was September 15, 2012, and the Oregon Department of Transportation had hired his geological consulting firm to conduct environmental impact studies before construction could begin. The project would carve a 4-lane highway through some of the most challenging terrain in the Cascade Mountains, requiring extensive blasting and excavation. Chen had spent 20 years studying Northwest geology, but this particular stretch of mountains presented unique complications. The proposed highway would cross 3 different rock formations, 2 major fault lines, and dozens of seasonal creek beds that could cause flooding problems during spring snowmelt. "We need to know exactly what's under the surface before we start moving dirt," explained ODOT project manager Sarah Williams during their initial site meeting. "The last thing we want is to hit an underground river or unstable cavern system that delays construction for months." The survey work began with traditional methods. Chen's team conducted core sampling, measured rock density, and mapped surface water flow patterns. But the real breakthrough would come from ground-penetrating radar, technology that could reveal underground structures invisible to conventional surveying. Chen had been using GPR equipment for 15 years, but the latest models were remarkably more sophisticated than the bulky machines of the 1990s. The new radar could penetrate up to 60 feet underground and create detailed 3-dimensional maps of subsurface formations. For highway construction, this meant identifying potential sinkholes, underground streams, or unstable soil conditions that could cause road failure. The work was methodical and often boring. Chen's team would set up the radar equipment, slowly walk predetermined grid patterns, and record data that would later be analyzed by computer software. Most of the readings showed exactly what they expected: solid bedrock, occasional groundwater, and the typical geological features of the Cascade Range. But on September 23, 2012, something unusual appeared on Chen's monitor. The radar was scanning an area 2 miles northeast of the proposed highway route, checking for potential environmental impacts on a nearby watershed. The readings showed what appeared to be a large void approximately 40 feet below the surface, much larger than any natural cave formation they had encountered. "That's weird," Chen muttered to his assistant, Jamie Rodriguez. "This area isn't supposed to have major cave systems. The limestone formations are all further south." He marked the coordinates on his GPS unit and made a note to investigate further. The void measured roughly 30 feet long by 20 feet wide, with what appeared to be a narrow entrance tunnel leading to a larger chamber. Even more intriguing, the radar detected metallic signatures within the void, suggesting the presence of man-made objects. Chen cross-referenced his readings with geological surveys dating back to the 1930s. The area had been studied multiple times for various projects, but no previous survey had detected the underground chamber. Either the earlier technology wasn't sophisticated enough to penetrate that deep, or something had changed in the subsurface structure over the decades. That evening, Chen called his contact at the Oregon Historical Society to ask about any known cave systems or mining activity in the area. The answer he received would change everything about his routine highway survey project. The Oregon Historical Society archivist, Patricia Summers, called Dr. Marcus Chen back at 7:30 the next morning, Her voice carried an excitement that made Chen sit up straighter in his hotel room chair. After 30 years of managing dusty records and forgotten documents, Summers had stumbled across something that made her hands shake as she pulled files from storage boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. "You're not going to believe what I found," Summers said, the phone crackling with static from her old office equipment. "That area you're surveying, it's connected to one of Oregon's most famous unsolved mysteries. 5 railroad workers vanished there in 1941, never found despite massive search efforts." Chen opened his laptop and pulled up the previous day's radar readings while Summers explained the basics of the McKenzie case. The metallic signatures suddenly took on new significance. Railroad workers would have carried metal tools, lunch pails, maybe even survey equipment that could show up on modern ground-penetrating technology. "The original search focused on surface areas," Summers continued, reading from files that chronicled 70 years of failed investigations. "They used dogs, helicopters, ground teams covering hundreds of square miles, but nobody thought to look underground. Cave exploration wasn't really possible with 1940s technology." Chen studied his radar data with fresh eyes. The void was positioned almost exactly 2 miles from where the workers' handcar had been found abandoned. If the men had been exploring the area, investigating track subsidence or geological problems, they might have discovered the cave entrance and ventured inside. The historical record Summers faxed to Chen's hotel revealed crucial details that earlier investigators had missed or ignored. December 7th, 1941, the same day the workers disappeared, had been marked by a minor earthquake measuring 3.2 on the Richter scale. The tremor's epicenter was located less than 5 miles from Chen's radar readings. An earthquake could easily cause a cave entrance to collapse, Chen explained to his assistant Jamie Rodriguez as they returned to the site the next morning. If those workers were inside when the entrance sealed, they would have been trapped with no way to signal for help. The more detailed radar scans Chen conducted over the following days painted an increasingly compelling picture. The underground chamber appeared to have 2 distinct sections, a smaller area near what would have been the original entrance, and a larger space deeper underground. The metallic signatures were concentrated in both areas, suggesting the presence of multiple objects. Most significantly, Chen's equipment detected what appeared to be structural modifications within the cave. Natural caves typically have irregular walls and floors, but the radar showed areas with unusually straight lines and organized patterns. Someone had been working inside that underground space, arranging objects, possibly even building shelter structures. "This isn't just a cave," Chen told Rodriguez after reviewing 3 days of intensive scanning. "This is an occupied cave, or at least it was at one time. The radar is picking up evidence of human habitation, organized camping areas, maybe even construction work." Chen faced a difficult decision. His contract with the Department of Transportation called for geological surveying related to highway construction, not archaeological investigation of 70-year-old disappearances. But the evidence was too compelling to ignore, and 5 families had been searching for answers for 7 decades. That evening, Chen placed a call that would change everything. The call went to Helen Kowalski first, reaching her at the Forest Service office in Bend where she had worked for 37 years. At 71, she was the oldest surviving child of the missing railroad workers, the baby who had grown up hearing stories about a father she never knew. When Dr. Marcus Chen explained what his ground-penetrating radar had discovered, Helen sat in stunned silence for nearly a minute. "You think you found them?" she finally whispered, her voice breaking with 7 decades of suppressed hope. "You think my father is down there?" Within hours, Helen had contacted the extended network of families and researchers who had kept the case alive for generations. Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie, now 88 and confined to a wheelchair but still mentally sharp, wept openly when Helen called with the news. Robert McKenzie canceled business meetings and drove from Portland. Susan McKenzie called in sick from her teaching job for the first time in 15 years. The excavation required specialized equipment and expertise that went far beyond normal construction work. Chen contacted Mountain Recovery Systems, a Colorado-based company that specialized in cave rescues and archaeological excavations in challenging terrain. The cost would be enormous, but Helen Kowalski had inherited her father's railroad pension and life insurance benefits, money she had saved for exactly this kind of emergency. "We've been waiting 71 years, Helen told the excavation team leader, Mike Patterson, during the planning meeting. "Whatever it costs, however long it takes, we're going to find out what happened to our fathers." The excavation began on October 15th, 2013, exactly 72 years, and 1 month after the workers disappeared. Local media covered the story extensively, drawing crowds of curious onlookers to the remote mountain site. The Oregon State Police established a perimeter to keep sightseers at a safe distance, while heavy machinery began the delicate process of removing tons of rock and soil. Patterson's team worked slowly and carefully, using pneumatic tools to break through the collapsed cave entrance without damaging anything that might be preserved inside. The work was dangerous, requiring constant monitoring for unstable rock conditions and potential cave-ins that could trap the excavation workers, just as they had trapped the railroad crew decades earlier. Margaret McKenzie, Tommy's youngest daughter, now 69, and retired from a career as a social worker, stood vigil at the excavation site every day. She had been 8 years old when her father disappeared, and her memories of him were more emotional than factual. "I remember his laugh," she told reporters. "He had this wonderful, deep laugh that made everyone feel safe. I've been wondering my whole life what happened to that laugh." On October 18th, after 3 days of careful digging, Patterson's drill broke through into the underground chamber. Air samples tested safe, and fiber optic cameras lowered into the void revealed what everyone had been hoping and dreading to find. The cave was there, exactly as Chen's radar had indicated, and it wasn't empty. "We've got structures," Patterson reported over the radio. "Definite signs of human habitation. This is going to be a major archaeological recovery." So, the families gathered closer, as Patterson prepared to descend into the cave that had kept their secret for over 7 decades. Mike Patterson descended into the cave on October 20th, 2013, his headlamp cutting through darkness that had remained undisturbed for over 70 years. The specialized breathing equipment felt heavy on his back as he rappelled down the narrow entrance shaft, but the weight was nothing compared to the responsibility he carried for the families waiting anxiously above ground. The first thing that struck him was how perfectly preserved everything appeared. The dry mountain air and sealed environment had created natural refrigeration that kept organic materials from decomposing normally. His radio crackled as he reported his initial observations to the surface team. "I'm seeing camping equipment," Patterson's voice echoed up from the cave. "Looks like 1940s vintage. There's a lean-to shelter built against the far wall, constructed with branches and what appears to be canvas tarps. This wasn't temporary camping, folks. Someone lived down here for an extended period." Helen Kowalski pressed closer to the radio speaker, tears streaming down her weathered face. 71 years of wondering, of hoping, of imagining what might have happened to her father, and finally someone was describing the place where Jake Kowalski had spent his final days. Patterson's headlamp illuminated details that painted a picture of desperate survival and remarkable ingenuity. A fire pit had been constructed near the shelter, with a crude chimney system designed to channel smoke toward a natural crack in the cave ceiling. Food containers hung from ropes attached to rock protrusions, positioned to keep supplies safe from any animals that might have shared the underground space. "There's a water collection system," Patterson continued, his voice filled with professional admiration for the engineering skills displayed. "They've positioned tarps and containers to catch water dripping from the ceiling. Very clever work. Shows these men understood long-term survival techniques." The radio fell silent for several minutes as Patterson explored deeper into the cave system. When his voice returned, it carried a different tone, more solemn and respectful. "I've found personal belongings, work clothes, boots, what looks like a leather-bound book wrapped in oilcloth. There are railroad company tools scattered around the camping area." Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie, listening from her wheelchair at the cave entrance, closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she had been saying for 72 years. Her father's tools were down there, the hammers and wrenches and measuring devices that had been extensions of his skilled hands. Patterson's most significant discovery came in the deepest section of the cave, where his light revealed something that made him stop breathing for a moment. "I need the coroner down here," he said quietly into his radio. "I've found human remains. Multiple individuals. Appears to be 5 sets of remains positioned in different areas of the cave." The families above ground held each other as the reality finally hit them. Their missing fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers were really down there, preserved in the mountain cave where they had fought to survive through the winter of 1941 and 42. But the most important discovery was still waiting deeper in the cave, wrapped carefully in oilcloth and positioned where someone had intended it to be found. Tommy McKenzie's journal would finally tell the complete story of what had happened during those lost months in the mountains. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the forensic anthropologist called in from Oregon State University, handled Tommy McKenzie's journal with white cotton gloves and the reverence reserved for historical artifacts. The leather-bound book had been wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth and tucked into a metal ammunition box, showing that whoever preserved it understood its importance for future discovery. The families gathered in the Jackson County Sheriff's Conference Room on October 22, 2013, as Mitchell carefully opened the journal to the first entry. The ink had faded to brown, but Tommy's neat handwriting remained perfectly legible after 71 years underground. December 7th, 1941. Mitchell read aloud, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. We came down here to investigate track subsidence. Found this cave system by accident when Patrick noticed cold air coming from behind some fallen rocks. Decided to explore a little before reporting back to Harold. Helen Kowalski gripped her grandson's hand as the truth began to emerge. Her father and his crew hadn't planned to disappear, hadn't been running from anything or trying to avoid military service. They had simply been doing their jobs, investigating a maintenance problem that led them to discover something unexpected. The second entry, dated the same day, revealed the moment when routine exploration became a fight for survival. Cave entrance collapsed during the earthquake this afternoon. We felt the ground shake, heard rocks falling, then everything went quiet. Tried digging out, but the opening is completely sealed. We're trapped down here with whatever supplies we have in our lunch pails and tool bags. Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie, now listening from her wheelchair with tears streaming down her face, had waited 8 decades to learn that her father's disappearance had been a terrible accident, not an abandonment of his family responsibilities. Mitchell turned to the third entry, dated December 8th. Ray thinks we can survive until rescue teams find us. The cave stays warm, there's water dripping from the ceiling, and we have enough food for maybe a week if we're careful. Patrick found another chamber deeper in the cave that might have more space. Jake is talking about trying to dig our way out, but the rockfall looks too heavy for hand tools. The journal entries painted a picture of 5 skilled men applying their practical knowledge to an impossible situation. They had built shelter, established water collection systems, and organized their meager supplies with the efficiency of people who understood hard work and problem solving. December 15th, 1941, Mitchell continued. Been here over a week now. We can hear search helicopters sometimes, voices calling our names, but they sound so far away. The cave must be deeper underground than we thought. Started rationing food more strictly. Jake found some kind of roots growing near the water source, might be edible. Robert McKenzie wiped his eyes as he listened to descriptions of his father's leadership during the crisis. Even trapped underground with no hope of quick rescue, Tommy had kept detailed records and maintained the group's morale through their darkest hours. The truth was finally emerging after 7 decades, but it would prove more heartbreaking than anyone had imagined. Dr. Sarah Mitchell turned the page carefully as the journal entries moved into the new year of 1942. Tommy McKenzie's handwriting remained steady through Christmas and into January, but the content revealed the gradual deterioration of 5 men fighting against impossible odds. January 3rd, 1942, Mitchell read to the assembled families. We've been down here almost 4 weeks now. Jake rigged a calendar on the cave wall using chalk from his tool pouch. The boys are staying strong, but we're all losing weight. Found mushrooms growing in the deeper chamber. Taste terrible, but they're food. Helen Kowalski closed her eyes, imagining her 22-year-old father scraping mushrooms from cave walls to stay alive. Jake had been the youngest of the trapped workers, with a pregnant wife waiting at home and dreams of raising children who would never know their father's voice. The entries from mid-January showed increasing desperation mixed with remarkable ingenuity. The 5 men had constructed elaborate water collection systems, organized their remaining tools for potential escape attempts, and even established a rotation schedule for maintaining the fire that provided both warmth and light. January 20th, 1942, Mitchell continued. Patrick thinks he found a way to the surface, a narrow passage in the back of the main chamber. Too small for a man, but we're going to try widening it with hand tools. Ray carved a chess set from soft stone to keep our minds sharp. We play tournaments in the evenings. Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie marveled at her father's leadership, even in the face of certain death. Tommy had kept the group organized, maintained morale, and continued making detailed records that would someday tell their story. But the February entries revealed the harsh reality of their situation. February 5th, 1942. Jake is sick, running fever, and complaining of stomach pains. The mushrooms might be making us ill, but they're the only food we have left. Patrick's escape tunnel collapsed yesterday, nearly buried him in the rockfall. The first death came on February 10th. Jake passed away this morning, Tommy wrote in shaking handwriting. We held him while he died, told him about the baby he'll never meet, buried him in the deepest part of the cave where the ground is softest. God help us all. Mary Kowalski, now 81 and Jake's widow, sobbed quietly as she learned that her husband had died, thinking about their unborn daughter Helen, who was sitting beside her holding her hand. The remaining 4 men lasted another month. Ray Washington died on March 2nd, followed by Patrick O'Malley on March 10th. Sean O'Malley survived until March 15th, leaving Tommy alone in the cave with 4 graves and the terrible knowledge that rescue would never come. March 20th, 1942. Mitchell read Tommy's final entry. I'm the last one alive. 71 days we fought to survive down here. 71 days of hoping someone would find us. I'm too weak to continue. Sarah, Elizabeth, Robert, Susan, Margaret, if you ever read this, know that I loved you more than life itself. Tell the other families their men died as heroes. The conference room fell silent except for quiet weeping as 71 years of mystery finally revealed its heartbreaking truth. The discovery of Tommy McKenzie's journal triggered a federal investigation into the railroad company's handling of the 1941 disappearance. FBI forensic accountant Linda Torres arrived in Portland 3 days after the cave excavation, armed with court orders to examine corporate records that had been sealed for over 70 years. What Torres found in the company archives shocked even veteran investigators who had seen decades of corporate misconduct cases. Hidden in a fireproof safe at the railroad's headquarters were photographs, geological surveys, and internal memos that painted a picture of deliberate deception spanning multiple decades. The smoking gun was a memo dated December 22, 1941. Just 15 days after the workers disappeared, company president Charles Whitmore had written to his board of directors. Survey team located collapsed cave entrance in Devil's Creek area. Preliminary investigation suggests missing workers are trapped underground. Recovery would require extensive excavation. Estimated cost $300,000 minimum. Recommend maintaining current search efforts while avoiding cave excavation. Amen or reason. Helen Kowalski listened in stunned silence as Torres read the memo aloud during a press conference at the Jackson County Courthouse. They knew, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For 71 years they knew exactly where our fathers were, and they let us suffer. The railroad company's internal documents revealed a calculated decision to prioritize profits over human life. Wartime contracts for troop transport and supply shipments were generating unprecedented revenue, and company executives feared that an expensive body recovery operation would drain resources needed for government work. More damning evidence emerged from the personal papers of Harold Brennan, the supervisor who had discovered the missing workers. Before his death in 1978, Brennan had written a confession letter to his priest, admitting that company officials had ordered him to alter work assignments and remove references to cave exploration from official records. I've carried this guilt for 37 years, Brennan wrote. Those families deserve to know their men died trying to do their jobs, not running away from responsibilities. The company paid me to stay quiet, gave me promotions and bonuses to keep the secret. I'm a coward who chose money over truth. The railroad company had systematically destroyed evidence, altered documents, and bribed employees to maintain the cover-up. Even the modest settlements paid to families in 1942 had included non-disclosure agreements designed to prevent further investigation. Torres discovered that company executives had visited the cave site multiple times between 1942 and 1945, confirming that the workers were dead, but deciding that recovery remained too expensive and risky. Internal documents showed they had even considered sealing the cave entrance permanently to eliminate any chance of accidental discovery. Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie, now 88, and one of the few people still alive who remembered the original investigation, faced reporters with quiet dignity despite her rage. They let us spend 71 years wondering, searching, blaming ourselves for not finding our fathers. They watched us suffer and said nothing. The legal implications were staggering. Although most of the original executives were dead, the railroad company that absorbed the original business faced potential criminal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. More importantly, the families finally had complete truth about what had happened to their missing men and why justice had been delayed for 7 decades. The lawsuit against Mountain Pacific Railroad Corporation was filed on November 15, 2013, exactly 1 month after the cave excavation revealed the truth about the missing workers. Attorney Rebecca Santos, a Portland civil rights lawyer who specialized in corporate accountability cases, took the case without charging the families any upfront fees. This isn't just about money, Santos explained to reporters outside the federal courthouse. This is about corporate responsibility and the fundamental right of families to know what happened to their loved ones. A railroad company covered up the deaths of 5 workers for 71 years, while their families suffered in ignorance. Mountain Pacific Railroad Corporation initially tried to claim that the original company's debts and responsibilities had been dissolved through multiple corporate mergers and acquisitions since 1941. But Santos's legal team traced the corporate lineage through 7 decades of business transactions, proving that the current company was legally liable for its predecessor's actions. The public reaction was explosive. Local television stations ran investigative series about corporate cover-ups and family tragedies. National news outlets picked up the story, turning the McKenzie case into a symbol of corporate greed versus human dignity. Protests formed outside Mountain Pacific's headquarters in Seattle, with demonstrators carrying photographs of the 5 missing workers. Helen Kowalski, now 72 and the unofficial spokesperson for the families, appeared on morning television shows and news programs across the country. Her quiet dignity and obvious pain touched viewers who couldn't imagine waiting 7 decades for answers about a missing parent. "They had pictures of where our fathers died," Helen told a CBS News interviewer. "They had maps showing exactly where the cave was located. They could have recovered the bodies in 1941 and given our families proper burials. Instead, they chose to protect their profits and let us wonder forever." The criminal investigation proceeded parallel to the civil lawsuit. Although most of the original executives were dead, federal prosecutors considered charging current Mountain Pacific officers with conspiracy to obstruct justice, based on evidence that company officials had continued concealing relevant documents well into the 21st century. Mountain Pacific's legal position crumbled when Santos's investigators discovered that company executives had known about Dr. Marcus Chen's radar findings weeks before the excavation began. Internal emails showed they had discussed ways to prevent the cave from being opened, including attempts to buy the land to stop the highway construction project. They were still trying to cover up the cover-up, Santos announced during a December press conference. Even in 2013, this company was more concerned about protecting itself than providing closure to grieving families. The settlement negotiations began in January of 2014. Mountain Pacific offered an initial settlement of $5 million, which the families rejected as inadequate compensation for 7 decades of emotional suffering. Santos pushed for $50 million plus establishment of a memorial fund and changes in corporate policies regarding workplace accidents. On March 20, 2014, exactly 72 years after Tommy McKenzie wrote his final journal entry, Mountain Pacific agreed to a $47 million settlement. The money would be divided among the surviving family members, with portions designated for a memorial scholarship fund and improved worker safety programs. Justice had finally arrived, though it came far too late for the families who had suffered the most. The funeral service for 5 railroad workers was held on a crisp October morning in 2014, 73 years after they had disappeared into the Oregon mountains. Highland Memorial Cemetery in Cascade Junction had donated a hillside plot overlooking the railroad tracks where the men had worked their entire adult lives. Helen Kowalski stood at her father's graveside, holding the folded American flag that had draped his casket during the memorial service. At 72, she was the oldest surviving child of the missing workers, the baby who had grown up hearing stories about a father she never knew. Now, finally, Jake Kowalski was coming home to rest beside his wife Mary, who had died in 2008, still wondering what had happened to her husband. Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie, 89 and frail but determined to attend, sat in her wheelchair as her father's casket was lowered into the ground next to her mother's grave. Margaret McKenzie had died in 1991, taking her questions and her hope to the grave. But Elizabeth had lived long enough to learn the truth, to understand that Tommy McKenzie had died as he had lived, taking care of his men and thinking of his family until his final breath. The O'Malley brothers were buried in the Catholic section of the cemetery, with Father Michael O'Brien conducting a special service in Gaelic to honor their Irish heritage. Patrick and Sean's grandchildren, most of whom had never known the story of their missing grandfathers, wept as they heard the ancient prayers their ancestors had carried from County Cork to Oregon. Ray Washington received full military honors, with an honor guard from the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post, firing a 21-gun salute over his flag-draped casket. His service in France during the Great War had earned him a Purple Heart, and now, finally, his sacrifice was being properly recognized. The Buffalo Soldiers Memorial Group sent representatives from across the Pacific Northwest to pay tribute to a man whose contributions had been forgotten for too long. Tommy McKenzie's burial drew the largest crowd, reflecting his role as crew foreman and the family's decades-long search for answers. Robert McKenzie, now 73 and using a cane, delivered a eulogy that focused on his father's character rather than his tragic death. "My father taught us that work was something to be proud of, that taking care of your crew was more important than taking care of yourself," Robert said, his voice carrying across the hillside cemetery. He died the way he lived, making sure his men were as safe and comfortable as possible. That's the father I want to remember. The ceremony concluded with a traditional railroad bell, borrowed from the Oregon Railway Museum, tolling 5 times for each of the workers. The sound echoed across the valley where they had spent their final days, a tribute that connected their memory to the work they had loved. Susan McKenzie, now 78, and the last surviving child, who had clear memories of her father, placed a wreath of pine boughs on each grave. The evergreen branches came from trees growing near the cave where the men had died, bringing them full circle from their mountain grave to their final resting place among family and friends. After 73 years, the 5 railroad workers were finally home. The McKenzie Memorial Visitor Center opened on December 7, 2015, exactly 74 years after the 5 railroad workers disappeared into the Oregon mountains. Built with funds from the Mountain Pacific Railroad settlement, the center sits on a hillside overlooking the tracks where Tommy McKenzie, Jake Kowalski, Patrick and Sean O'Malley, and Ray Washington spent their final working day. Helen Kowalski, now 73, cut the ribbon at the dedication ceremony, her hands steady despite her age, as she performed the honor her father never lived to see. "This memorial isn't just about 5 missing workers," she told the crowd of dignitaries, family members, and curious visitors. "It's about the importance of truth, the value of never giving up, and the responsibility we all have to take care of each other." The center displays artifacts recovered from the cave where the men died, including tools, personal belongings, and pages from Tommy McKenzie's journal. But the most powerful exhibit is a detailed timeline showing how modern technology finally solved a 74-year-old mystery, demonstrating that some questions can be answered if people refuse to stop asking them. Dr. Elizabeth McKenzie lived to see the memorial's opening, passing away peacefully 3 months later at age 90. Her final project was establishing the Working Families Emergency Fund, using her portion of the railroad settlement to help families facing financial crises, similar to what had driven some people to suspect her father of deliberate abandonment. "My father died believing his family would think he had run away," Elizabeth wrote in her final letter to the Memorial Foundation. "No family should have to wonder about a missing loved one the way we wondered for 74 years. This fund will help people before desperation makes them consider desperate choices." The memorial's educational programs focus on workplace safety, family support systems, and the importance of corporate accountability. School groups visit regularly to learn about Depression-era working conditions and how labor protection laws evolved to prevent similar tragedies. Susan McKenzie, the last survivor who remembered her father personally, became the memorial's first volunteer coordinator at age 79. She spent her remaining years giving tours to visitors, sharing stories about Tommy McKenzie the father rather than Tommy McKenzie the missing worker. "People want to know what he was like before he disappeared," Susan would tell tour groups. "He taught us to fish, built tree houses, read stories every night before bed. He was just a regular father who loved his family and took pride in his work. The tragedy is important, but the man was more important than the mystery." Mountain Pacific Railroad Corporation funded annual safety training programs as part of the legal settlement, using the McKenzie case as an example of what can happen when companies prioritize profits over people. The programs have prevented numerous workplace accidents and established protocols for emergency situations that didn't exist in 1941. The cave where the 5 men died remains sealed, marked by a bronze plaque reading, "In memory of Thomas McKenzie, Jacob Kowalski, Patrick O'Malley, Sean O'Malley, and Raymond Washington. Dedicated workers, loving family members, American heroes who never came home." Sometimes the truth takes 74 years to emerge, but when it finally surfaces, it honors not just the dead, but the living who refuse to forget them.